Sustainability 101. Indigenuity is not optional. And by indigenuity, this is a term that Daniel Wildcat coined, indigenous ingenuity. I'm Michael Dowd, and I'm recording this in October of 2020. This is the third in a primer, a collapse and adaptation primer. Each of them is a standalone program. First program, Collapse 101, The Inevitable Fruit of Progress. Second program, Post-Gloom, Deeply Adapting to Reality. And then this program, Sustainability 101, Indigenuity is not optional. Collapse 101, take a look at what's collapsing and why, what is genuinely unstoppable and what's also futile, and why and how hubris always causes ecocide. Post-Gloom, take a look at how science can help us to know thyself, why death is essential and necessary and good in the universe, and finding joy and meaning in hard times. This program, take a look at why naming reality matters, why fidelity or what fidelity to the future means, and how ecocentrism, life-centeredness, can transform religion. So Sustainability 101, indigenuity is not optional. First, we'll look at first things first, that our name for primary reality is an existential issue. It's a life and death issue. Sustainable equals faithful, the evolutionary and ecological purpose of religion and the religious necessity of science. And then unnatural versus undeniable, anti-future versus pro-future religious interpretations. Again, just a little deeper, just to give you a sense of where we're going in this program, why impersonal names for the ecosphere induce human arrogance and disregard, why religion needs science and why evidence and the ecosphere needs a prophetic moral voice, and how mythic stories and concepts can be reframed in a pro-science and ecologically wise way. This sentiment sums up this program. Sustainable means faithful to the past and faithful to the future. Unsustainable means unfaithful to the past and the future. And everything else I suggest is but a footnote or a distraction. So there's two vital distinctions. The first is the distinction between secular language and mythic language. These are as essential to our nature as the two halves of our brain. And in fact, this comes from that research. In McGilchrist's famous book, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain in the Making of the Western World. That is, secular language is all about helping us to understand reality. Mythic language, if it's doing its job, is to help us to relate to reality, and both are necessary. I first came to this understanding back in the 1980s when Walter Ong, the great Jesuit scholar on orality and literacy, I've read a number of his books. He also covers the same thing. And then, of course, James Hillman's famous Terry lectures delivered in, I think, 1976 in this book, Re-Envisioning Psychology, the necessity of personification. That's the essence of mythic speech, is personification. I'll say more about that here in a few minutes. The other vital distinction is the distinction between sustainable cultures and unsustainable civilizations. But of course, that's a secular, rational way of talking about it. A mythic way of talking about it is faithful and unfaithful. Loyal Rue is a philosopher of religion, probably the leading philosopher of religion alive today, at least in the English-speaking world. He's written a number of books. One of them is Religion is Not About God. And what he means is that religion is about our relationship to reality. And yes, reality has been personified as various gods and goddesses. But if religion's doing its job, it's to help us live in right relationship to what's fundamentally, undeniably, and inescapably real. I love this quote. He says, the most profound insight in the history of humankind is that we should seek to live in accord with reality. Indeed, living in harmony with reality may be accepted as a formal definition of wisdom. If we live at odds with reality, foolishly, we will be doomed. But if we live in proper relationship with reality, wisely, we can be saved. Just to let you know where I'm coming from, and I've covered this also in the previous two programs in this series, this Collapse and Adaptation primer. I'm a sacred realist. I'm a religious naturalist. I'm an evidential mystic, you could say. Here's my creed in a nutshell. I call it an Eco-Theo credo. Reality is my God. Evidence is my scripture. The epic of evolution is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path. And promoting evolutionary and ecological faithfulness is my mission. So I'll come back to this slide at the end of this program and go a little bit more deeply into it. Right relationship to reality is fundamental for all species. We either live in right relationship to reality or we get booted out of the body of life, basically. And words create worlds, and language, symbolic language, morphs over time. Joseph Brodsky, famous Russian literature professor. He won the Nobel Prize in literature, I think, in 1987. George Lakoff mentioned him a couple of years ago on Facebook, and he basically quoted this very famous quote. Brodsky said, "You Americans are so naive. You think evil is going to come into your houses wearing big black boots. It doesn't happen like that. Look at the language. It begins in the language." Well, nowhere is that more true than our language for primary reality. For example, what name do we give to that which brought everything into being, that which nourishes and sustains everything, and that which receives everything at its end? It's inescapable, real, right? But what do we call this reality? Well, what we call reality, what we call nature, what we call the biosphere. Indigenous, that is faithful, sustainable, pro-future cultures experienced personally and related to in an honorable I-thou way. Perhaps the most important thing that we understand through science now is that reality is nested, and how we name it is an existential issue. Nothing matters more than our name or names for primary reality. We live in a nested universe. We live in a nested reality. Subatomic particles within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies, and so on. All the way up and all the way down. And we're in the middle somewhere. And of course, it's obviously more complex. And so what I'm meaning by primary reality is everything that's required inside of us and outside of us that makes our lives even possible. That's primary reality. We need to have an I-thou, a personal, a respectful, a humble relationship. It turns out that without that, if we have a arrogant relationship to primary reality, we cause our own destruction. We have no examples in human history of that not being the case. It's Martin Buber spoke about it, the famous Jewish theologian, as an I-thou relationship to everything we depend upon. See, we now, most of us relate, at least in the Western world, an I-it relationship. We think of the universe as a complex clock and God as this clockmaker outside the universe. And that's a deadly worldview. It's an ecocidal worldview. So one of the things that we know about virtually every indigenous or pro-future or sustainable culture is that they shared, in spite of their radical differences in many cases, they all shared an eco-theo, what I'm calling an eco-theo worldview. That is, the ecos was related to as divine, as a greater thou, not a lesser it. And the theos, the spirit world, was infused, embodied, embedded, revealed, and expressed in and through the living world. Primary reality must be honored as primary. This is a fundamental law of sustainability. Gaia would be good enough. I mean, a proper name, an I-thou name, to accept in a culture where your concept of God, that is ultimate reality, is outside Gaia and doesn't include Gaia. So I've started spelling the word God with the emoji, the Earth emoji, capital G, capital O, capital D, where the O is the Earth emoji, or the Old English spelling. Many feminists and some Catholic nuns are spelling it this way. It's the Old English spelling of God, with or without the Earth emoji. It sounds the same, God, but what we're meaning is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. Whether spelled G-O-D-D-E or G-O-D capitals with the Earth emoji, it doesn't matter what we're meaning. It sounds the same, but we're meaning not anything you need to believe in. Reality with a personality. It doesn't matter whether we believe in reality or not. Just like every other species, though, we need to live in right relationship to reality or we perish. Now, I can always count on, when I do programs in colleges and universities, I can always count on some philosophy major to try to trip me up and say, well, what do you mean by reality? And I love Philip K. Dick's definition. He says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And whatever else is real to that extent, time is real, the past is real, whether we believe in it or not, and the future, if we act as if the future is not real, we will destroy the future. And nature is real. And of course, mystery is real, but time and nature are fundamental expressions of reality. I did a program, my second TEDx talk was titled Reality Reconciles Science and Religion back in 2014. And about a week before the event, they had a typo on their website, and it said, Reverend Michael Dowd, Reality, reconciles science and religion. So I let them know that they had the colon in the wrong spot, but I said, I got to tell you, I like this Reverend Reality thing. And well, they said, well, we do too. And my publicist, who'd got me a lot of press when my book came out about a dozen years ago, he said, Bill Nye, the science guy, Michael Dowd, Reverend Reality, we're running with this thing, right? So I looked online the next day and I found these Celtic green clergy shirts, long sleeve and short sleeve clergy shirts. So now this has become my regalia. I become Reverend Reality. I just love it. Thomas Berry, one of my biggest, most important mentors, said the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. Daniel Wildcat, who I mentioned at the beginning, said we live among relatives, not resources. And then Thomas Berry also said the environment is not our surroundings, it's our source, sustenance, and end. See, that's what I'm meaning by language. That's what Joseph Brodsky's getting at, that language is what trips us up. The evil comes in with language, because if we refer to primary reality as merely the environment and think we can exploit it for our benefit, we put ourselves on a path to where we actually are now. So I want to introduce more fully Daniel Wildcat. Daniel wrote a book called Red Alert, Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge. He coined the term Indigenuity, and here's his definition. He says, Indigenuity is the application of deep spatial indigenous knowledge to problem solving. Indigenuity looks at what is appropriate relative to a particular situation and a specific landscape. It asks us to once again connect technology, very dramatically and directly, to community, communication, and culture. And by community, he's including the ecosystem. Technology must be situated in this sort of framework so that we don't treat it as some sort of an autonomous tool separate from a culture or community. It includes the natural world, which we are a part of. In my way of languaging it, I'm speaking of ecology as the heart of theology, that ecology must be the heart of theology. So from this perspective, what's a God's eye view of the world? Well, with an otherworldly, trivial, ecocile notion of God, where we think of God as only outside a mechanistic universe, a God's eye view is the view from above and outside it all. But from this eco-theo perspective, a God's eye view, a reality's eye view of the world, is the view from within every set of eyes. It's the consciousness and awareness and understanding from within each subjective experience of every kind of creature that there is. A human being simply has no existence outside of the environment that is outside of Gaia or God. You don't find any humans like this, any farmers that look like this. There are only farmers in habitat, in community. This is the nature of reality. Thomas Berry famously said, our fundamental problem is that we no longer listen to what the earth, its landscape and climate, its mountains and valleys, and all the flora and fauna of the planet are telling us. He called it spiritual autism back in the 1980s, but it's being blind and deaf to what reality is telling us. My way of saying it is this, or building on that. We are committing ecocide. That is, the Western industrial capitalist world is committing ecocide because believers and atheists alike fail to relate to primary reality as primary. By not honoring and revering the biosphere as our biophysical creator, sustainer, and end, human-centered, that is anthropocentric civilizations inevitably self-destruct. I think the reason that we are not aware of what life is telling us as divine guidance is because we failed to understand what I consider one of the most important scientific discoveries of the last several hundred years, which is that our brains are inherently relational. We can't not relate. And the way that we do that primarily is through what's called personification, that is giving human characteristics to what's more than human, what's other than human. Wendell Berry understood the power of personification. He said, nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. James Hillman, one of the most famous psychologists of the last 75 years, he said, you can't even understand the world's myths and religions if you don't understand our brain's propensity to give human characteristics to what's more than human. He said, loving is a way of knowing, and for love to know, it must personify. Personifying is thus the heart's mode of knowing. It's not a lesser, primitive way of apprehending, but a finer one. To enter myth, we must personify, and to personify carries us into myth. Now, he's not meaning by myth an untrue story. He's meaning it the way Joseph Campbell used it, a narrative that puts us in accord with the nature of reality. Any god, any goddess, any spiritual entity can be understood in a fictional way or a factional way. That is, an undeniable way or an unnatural way. For example, Poseidon was not the god of the oceans or the spirit of the oceans. Poseidon was a personification of the incomprehensibly powerful and capricious seas. Helios was a personification of what we call the sun, this great ball of flame and light that gives us life. And you didn't find atheists several thousand years ago saying, oh, I don't believe in Helios. Whatever you mean by this is what we're talking about. It's reality. It's a dimension of reality. Gaia was not the goddess of the earth or the spirit of the earth. Gaia was a personification of earth, inescapably real. Same Eros. Eros was a personification of love or lust. These are personifications, not persons. And notice the radical difference between believing in Gaia and worshiping Gaia, or honoring Poseidon and respecting Poseidon. There's a huge difference. And you don't have to take my word on it. Google anthropomorphism, deities personification, or gods, goddesses personify. And especially if you put like gods, goddesses personify and put Aztec or China or Greece or Rome or anything after it, you'll find dozens of web pages and all the various gods and goddesses from that culture and what aspect of reality or inner reality or outer reality was being personified. This is commonly known in the academic world. It's just that most people don't know this. And the first major scholarly work in, I think it was 1992 or 93, Stuart Guthrie, Faces in the Clouds, A New Theory of Religion, Oxford University Press. He brought this forth. And in less than a decade and a half, this became the commonly accepted foundation of an entire research discipline of people studying religion from an academic science-based perspective. The Religious Studies Project, the Evolutionary Religious Studies, most recently the Evolution Institute. Nature is Speaking, Hollywood and Conservation International got the memo on personification some years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago now. And if you go to natureisspeaking.org, you'll find all of these Hollywood stars personifying some aspect of reality. And you can feel the power of personification through these. I'm just going to give one example here. This is Julia Roberts, not speaking about Mother Nature. She's Mother Nature speaking.
Some call me nature. Others call me Mother Nature. I've been here for over 4.5 billion years, 22,500 times longer than you. I don't really need people, but people need me. Yes, your future depends on me. When I thrive, you thrive. When I falter, you falter. Or worse. But I've been here for eons. I have fed species greater than you, and I have starved species greater than you. My oceans, my soil, my flowing streams, my forests, they all can take you or leave you. How you choose to live each day, whether you regard or disregard me, doesn't really matter to me. One way or the other. Your actions will determine your fate, not mine. I am nature. I will go on. I am prepared to evolve. Are you?
I encourage you to go to natureisspeaking.org and just watch some of these. There's about 15 or 16 of them. They're all just 1 or 2 minutes long. And of course, those of us who choose to use the word God, if we're not meaning all of these, every one of these is reality telling us something important. For example, think about climate. We don't know of a culture anywhere in the world that didn't personify what we call the climate and interpret it as either divine blessing or divine judgment. And it's not a surprise. I mean, can you think of any force in the universe that more consistently brings cultures into being, sustains them, and destroys them than climate? And as one example of personification, in the Hindu tradition, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, if you think of these as separate spiritual entities outside the universe, you completely don't get it. This is a personification of the creative force, the sustaining force, and the destroying force of reality. We need to demythologize faith, that is, to unpack it from its mythic wrapping. Your God is whatever you put your faith or trust in. In other words, your ultimate concern. And this isn't just Michael Dowd saying this. Arguably the most influential Protestant theologian of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, famously identified faith as your ultimate concern. If progress is your ultimate concern, then that is your God. So we took a quick look at how our name for primary reality is an existential issue. It's a life or death issue. Let's take a look at my claim that sustainable equals faithful, the evolutionary and ecological purpose of religion and the religious necessity of science. The two scholars that have done more, mainstream scholars that have done more to further this evolutionary understanding of religion, are David Sloan Wilson and Edward O. Wilson. Now, they're not related, at least not closely, but they've both written extensively. Ed Wilson is probably, arguably, the most famous scientist alive today. And they've both written about the evolutionary and ecological significance of religion and the religious necessity of science, although those are my words. And David Sloan Wilson has this very powerful distinction, very important distinction between practical truth or practical knowledge, practical realism, and factual truth or factual knowledge, factual realism. Turns out practical truth is our beliefs that if you act as if it's true, you'll experience personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. Factual truth is what science specializes in, but if factual truth is not also interpreted as practically true, then it can develop technologies that can kill us, which is what we're seeing. And what David Sloan Wilson makes the point is that in an evolutionary arms race, practical truth, which is what religion ideally specializes in, practical truth will outcompete factual truth every day of the week. So that's why our scientific knowledge needs to be interpreted in ways that help us live in right relationship to reality. So let's take a look at the vital role of ecocentric, life-centered lifeways. Edward Goldsmith, was the publisher and the senior editor of The Ecologist magazine for 35, 40 years. And this will give you a sense of Teddy Goldsmith. He says, it may not be irrelevant to note that even very modest forms of life, like earthworms, dung beetles, and fiddler crabs, have no trouble identifying the real problems that they must deal with if they're to survive. Teddy Goldsmith identified religion, in fact, he defined religion as the control mechanism of stable, sustainable societies. What he means by control mechanism is that aspect of culture that speaks with moral authority and ensuring that the future is not compromised by the present. He identified three fundamental things that virtually every sustainable culture, virtually all pro-future cultures had in common. A sense that all benefits and all real wealth come from the living biosphere, what I'm calling God with an earth emoji. Doesn't matter the name. What matters is, do you treat this reality as primary and you are derivative? So all benefits and all real wealth come from the living biosphere. That life or the biosphere or God, reality, will only continue to dispense these benefits and wealth if life's critical order, that is, its essential integrity or way, is honored and preserved. So that the fundamental role of religion or life ways in indigenous cultures is to ensure that the culture or society remains faithful to time and nature, that is, faithful to the past that is the ancestors, faithful to the future, the descendants, and faithful to the community of life, the body of life upon which you depend. How did it do this? Well, by fiercely preserving the integrity of the ecosphere and the critical order of the cosmos, that is the way. And I've identified 4 things that seem to be common to all cultures, all sustainable pro-future cultures. A sense of life first, God first. I'm using the word God here, but whatever the proper name for the biosphere was, not just an it name. So God first, 7th generation, sacred limits, and consequence capture. And I have exclamation points simply because these were enforced upon pain of death or being ostracized. Let's take a look at these a little more deeply. I call them the 4 laws of genuine sustainability, true sustainability. God first is an ecocentric, life-centered, not an anthropocentric or human-centered measures of progress and success. If well-being, progress and success is measured in life-centered terms, that is like how well the soil is doing decade by decade, how well are the forests doing, how well are the other species doing, how's the climate doing, everything that we depend upon, if we measure well-being by how well that's doing on a year-by-year, decade-by-decade basis, that's an ecocentric measure of well-being. Turns out that's the only thing that's sustainable. Human-centered measures of well-being, measured by how well individuals or corporations or nations or any other groups are doing, is unsustainable. It's ultimately self-destructive. So God first, or life first. 7th generation, failing to prioritize the future over the present is evil. I'll say more about good and evil language, morally laden language here in a little bit, but it's a moral obligation to invite future generations to help you decide how to make decisions in the present moment. That's the thing. Acting with the 7th generation in mind isn't just a good idea. To do otherwise leads good people to do evil. Sacred limits, material grace limits, are real and must be honored. There's a limit to how much we can take from the living world and a limit to how much waste we can exude to the living world before the systems start breaking down. In ecological language, this is known as a carrying capacity. The carrying capacity of a bioregion or a continent or anything else are the grace limits, and those must be honored. And then finally, consequence capture. The impacts for good or ill that individuals or groups of individuals have on the body of life must be mirrored back to them. This is the fundamental thing, that it's shifting from thinking that we can have personal benefit, individuals and corporations get wealthy in ways that exploit or harm the future. This is insane. What this is, consequence capture, is where individuals, corporations, and nation states that do well to the larger common good benefit, and the more good they do, the more they benefit. And individuals, corporations, and nation states that disregard or harm the common good are taxed or penalized, or there's moral strictures, so that it becomes in their self-interest to do the right, just, ecological thing, and it also becomes in their self-interest to not do the unjust or unecological thing. This is fundamental to all sustainable cultures, this consequence capture. So I use these terms interchangeably: pro-future, pro-nature, God first or life first, eco-theo. These are different ways of saying the same thing. So coming back here to Teddy Goldsmith, I mentioned before that he identified both in his book, The Stable Society, and his magnum opus, The Way, an Ecological Worldview. These are 2 of his more well-known books. Actually, the most popular book was A Blueprint for Survival. I think it's the 2nd or 3rd most popular environmental book of all time. About 750,000 people purchased it. But in The Way and The Stable Society, he identifies religion, as I said before, as the control mechanism of sustainable cultures. But in unsustainable cultures, religion downgrades to a coping mechanism. It helps people cope with the fact that this religion evolved in a culture that was already living unsustainably and couldn't in any real way hold the political and economic establishment to ecological principles. So in the table of contents to The Way, Goldsmith has this, that in traditional cultures, in stable, sustainable, pro-future societies, technology is in accord with the needs of the biosphere. Settlements, the economy, education, community, basically everything is in accord with the needs of the biosphere. But of course, these cultures didn't refer to what we call the biosphere. They had some divine personification for this reality. And again, this makes sense when you realize the nested nature of reality and that we are dependent upon smaller subsystems, such as our microbiome, and the trees and the forests and the other species and everything else. Religion needs science, and evidence needs a moral voice. And this can't happen, this won't happen when the biosphere is exploited as it rather than honored as thou. This is what I'm meaning. Again, using mythic language to speak of faithful is a relational thing. That's the mythic part of our brain. But sustainable means faithful. It means faithful to the ancestors, faithful to the descendants, and faithful to the body of life upon which we depend. And some of the wonderful Indigenous voices. Stan Rushworth is an Indigenous elder. Dar Jamel is working with him on a documentary. There was another documentary done that featured Dar Jamel and Stan Rushworth, as well as Jem Bendel and Catherine Ingram. But these are two of Stan Rushworth's books. Julia Watson just recently came out with Low Tech, that's TEK, capital TEK, which is Traditional Ecological Knowledge, designed by Radical Indigenism, which has examples all over the world. And then one of the most important, best books I've ever read in my life is Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, bringing together Indigenous wisdom and scientific knowledge. These are profound. There's many, many others. There are also people like Teddy Goldsmith and like Richard Adrian Reese who've taken a look at human history and has shown that sustainable means faithful. That is, as the bioregion does well or poorly, the society does, but there's a sense of living without change, that you pass on the wisdom of the ancestors faithfully to the descendants. And this is the first 97 to 99% of human history. That is where we lived with a sense of, it's almost ahistorical. Little change happens very slightly over long periods of time. It's the opposite of the telephone game, which is, your person tells, and then you go around and the final person has a totally different message. No, this is faithfully passing on the wisdom from one generation to another. And there are lots of crazy things on sustainability that you can find all over the internet, including the Wikipedia, that starts with civilization, which is almost the definition of unsustainable. Teddy Goldsmith and Richard Adrian Reese. In fact, his book in process, Wild, Free, and Happy, is phenomenal. And I've recorded that, and I've recorded also a number of the best overviews of the way, and I've recorded the entirety of the stable society. Unsustainable, which is virtually all civilizations. There are some exceptions of indigenous civilizations, city-based civilizations that are actually genuinely sustainable, such as the Kogi Indians in Colombia. But the vast, almost 99% of the civilizations that have existed, this is the pattern, the last 1 to 3% of human history. Only 400 generations as opposed to 20,000 generations. 100 plus civilizations, we see this pattern. The well-being of the elites and ruling class gets exponentially bigger with what gets called wealth and progress. And the well-being of the bioregion and the habitat, that is carrying capacity, real wealth, goes down exponentially. And where they cross is where the society is an overshoot. When you understand ecology, energy, and history, you understand why unsustainable civilizations always self-destruct. And there are several great books. I'm mentioning a number of books because this series, this 3-video series in collapse and adaptation, is really the summing up of what I've been studying for the last 7.5, 8 years. I've read 1,000 hours of books and recorded them. I'll talk about how to access them for free at the end. But these books, A Forest Journey, The Story of Wood and Civilization by John Perlin, chronicles again and again and again, it becomes almost relentless, of societies, civilizations that used up their trees, then tried to take over other cultures that had trees, because of course trees were the primary source of fuel, of energy prior to fossil fuels. And then the soil's washed away and civilization collapses. So A Forest Journey, Geodestinies by Walter Youngquist, The Inevitable Control of Earth's Resources Over Nations and Individuals. A New Green History of the World by Clive Ponting. I've recorded several of the best overview summaries of that, including a 60-page summary overview. And then the classic book, the most important book I've ever read in my life, Overshoot by William Catton. In fact, here's a quote from William Catton. These are two quotes. I also had these in the first program, Collapse 101. Human society is inextricably part of a global biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. Thomas Berry, one of the most profound ecological and evolutionary thinkers of the 20th century, has a similar quote. He says, the most difficult transition to make is from a human-centered to a life-centered norm of progress. If there's to be any true progress, the entire life community must progress. Any so-called progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. And of course, this makes total sense when you remember the nested nature of reality and our place in that. William Ophuls, in his masterful little short 100-page book called Apologies to the Grandchildren, reflections on our ecological predicament, its deeper causes, and its political consequences. This is his introduction. This is the first paragraph to this book. Civilization is by its very nature a long-running Ponzi scheme. It lives by robbing nature and borrowing from the future, exploiting its hinterland until there's nothing left to exploit, after which it implodes. While it still lives, it generates a temporary and fictitious surplus that it uses to enrich and empower the few and to dispossess and to dominate the many. Industrial civilization is the apotheosis and quintessence of this fatal course. A fortunate minority gains luxuries and freedoms galore, but only by slaughtering, poisoning, and exhausting creation. William Ophuls, by the way, is one of the most significant thinkers in the English language of bringing the ecological paradigm to governance, to politics. In unsustainable cultures, this is the way we think of religion and science, because religion is all this otherworldly, supernatural, or superstitious stuff. In sustainable cultures, we see this. The evidential worldview has to fuel the religious understanding. Again, ideally, in healthy cultures, rationality, science helps us understand reality. Religion and myth helps us relate to reality, and both are absolutely essential. Turns out that human-centered views of the supernatural lead to ecocide. See, think about it. To even have the concept of the supernatural, you're already treating the natural not as divine. This point was made forcefully by Benson Saylor back in 1977, wrote supernatural as a Western category. This paper has now been cited practically everywhere. There have been a few attempts to disprove it. Those proved inadequate. It's now widely accepted. And then I've mentioned before, Stuart Guthrie's Faces in the Clouds, Oxford University Press, and then most recently a textbook, Supernatural as Natural, a Biocultural Approach to Religion, Michael Winkelman and John Baker. Walter Wink was a Protestant theologian. He happened to be a friend and neighbor of mine, but he was the most significant Protestant theologian or biblical scholar that brought this understanding to his scholarship and his understanding of the Bible and the Christian tradition. In his books, his summary book was The Powers That Be, Theology for a New Millennium. But this was based on his award-winning trilogy. In 1984, his Naming the Powers, The Language of Power in the New Testament. 1986, Unmasking the Powers, The Invisible Forces That Determine Our Existence. And then 1992, Engaging the Powers, Discernment and Resistance in a World of Domination. Turns out when he spoke of power, the point that he makes is when the Bible, the New Testament, speaks of powers and principalities, these are not disembodied entities. These are personifications of corrupt and oppressive socio-political, economic, and religious regimes. Satan was a personification of a civilization's or society's structural injustices. These concepts are made foolish if we think of them as disembodied entities rather than personifications. What we would call systemic evil or corporate evil. So this concept, I think you could call one of the fundamental laws of life. Relate to the larger body of life as divine or perish. Thomas Berry famously said, "The world we live in is an honorable world. To refuse this deepest instinct of our being, to deny honor where honor is due, to withdraw reverence from divine manifestation, is to put ourselves on a collision course with the ultimate forces of the universe. This question of honor must be dealt with before any other question. It's ultimately not a political, economic, or even an environmental issue. It's ultimately a question of honor. Only the sense of the violated honor of Earth and the need to restore that honor will awaken in humans the passion and energy needed to co-create a just and healthy future. Two ways of relating to primary reality: sustainable and unsustainable, or what I'm saying, faithful or unfaithful. Faithful meaning accountable and honorable. It's a pro-future way. Unfaithful meaning unaccountable and dishonorable. It's an anti-future. Sustainable is the first 97 to 99% of human history, depending upon whether you start human history with Homo sapiens or Homo habilis. It's having a stable culture and honoring the ancestors, honoring the descendants, and honoring the biosphere, again, as a thou. Unsustainable is just the last 1 to 3% of human history, the most recent 8,000 years. We see scores of booms and busts, progress, which is undeniably real, and then regress, which is also undeniably real. I go into this in great depth with a lot more charts in my Pinker Takedown, the last half of the first video, Collapse 101, The Inevitable Fruit of Progress. Again, remembering the nested nature of reality. Faithful cultures, pro-future, honorable cultures have a humble, sane, life-centered, and a sense of sacred limits. Unfaithful, that is anti-future or ecocidal cultures, tend to be arrogant, a sense of hubris rather than humility, tend to be human-centered, and a sense of exploited. We exploit the living world, and that sense of limitlessness. Ecological overshoot, it turns out, is always a moral and religious failure. Human-centered measures of well-being lead to ecological overshoot, followed by societal simplification, which is a collapse of complexity, and dramatic population reduction, usually 90% or so. And we have dozens of examples of this, scores of examples of this over the past 7,000 years. So when I speak of human-centeredness or anthropocentrism, to use mythic language, this is idolatry. Idolatry isn't bowing down to statues, and it's not believing in the wrong God. Idolatry is human-centeredness rather than life-centeredness. Idolatry is having an unreal notion of God. It's when your sense of divinity is not synonymous with reality. It's failing to honor primary reality, the biosphere, as primary, and the sense that we are derivative. It's taking primary reality, that is the soil, forest, water, climate, life upon which we depend, taking all that for granted. It's having an ultimate authority, in your own mind at least, that leads us to betray and condemn the future. And there are both religious and secular forms of idolatry. The primary ways of the religious communities, at least in the Western world, exhibit this idolatry is idolatry of the written word, idolatry of the otherworldly, and idolatry of beliefs. That is, idolatry of the written word is when you think God's best guidance, that is our best map of reality, is locked in time in some ancient text. Idolatry of the otherworldly is where you think where ultimate reality resides or exists is only outside time and nature. And idolatry of beliefs is where we privilege beliefs over knowledge, over evidence. But there are secular forms of idolatry. Idolatry of progress, growth, and development. These are ecocidal expressions of anthropocentrism. Idolatry of human intelligence and agency, thinking that we can do anything that we want to just because we can think about it. And the sense of idolatry of technology, man, conqueror of nature, which is probably the single most self-destructive and idolatrous thought form in human history. When religion succumbs to human-centeredness, idolatry, we inevitably confuse good and evil. And demonic economics is a predictable result. Now, I realize I'm using very loaded religious terms here that most secular people just balk at or run in the opposite direction. Here are a few cartoons that capture this. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And so, while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, We believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. In this time of shared sacrifice, we must all wear our masks. Corporate bailouts, tax breaks, windfalls. I suggest that the theist versus atheist debate is a form of collective insanity. You've got thousands, maybe millions of people debating whether or not God exists or God is real, when the one real God, namely primary reality, the ecosphere, we've been treating as an it rather than a thou, and this is leading to our own extinction. This is crazy. This is insane. Any divinity that is not synonymous with reality and doesn't include what Gaia is evidentially telling us invites scorn and ridicule, as the new atheists have been, mocking and attacking otherworldly superstitious religion, and they've been doing a great job of it. Eco-theism, which is not atheism, is not theism, eco-theism, eco-theo, transcends and dissolves the theist-atheist debate by honoring the ecosphere and the cosmos as thou, by fostering humility rather than hubris, celebrating our personification instinct, and evolving rather than deriding tradition. It also facilitates religion's evolutionary and ecological reason for being. Mark Perkel died just a couple of years ago. I actually facilitated his funeral. He did something on YouTube that you can find. It's called Why Reality Needs a Religion and Why Atheism Isn't Good Enough. This is his presentation at the Humanist Community Forum in Silicon Valley. He's the founder of the Church of Reality, which his website's still going. There's some pretty odd things there. Mark was quite an interesting character, but there's some really profound stuff on this Church of Reality website. So here's what we've taken a look at. Let's conclude with unnatural versus undeniable. That is anti-future versus pro-future religious interpretations. I'm suggesting that ecocentrism, life-centeredness, can redeem or transform religious understandings. First, let's take a quick look at good and evil, realizing or untrivializing, unrelativizing good and evil. I mean, who decides what's right and what's wrong, what's good or evil? Those alive today or future generations? Well, in all sustainable cultures, there was a sense of being accountable or faithful to the future. Intergenerational justice, nothing's more important. In fact, all social justice issues, if they're not held in a larger context of intergenerational justice, we then commit ecocide. So the unique and necessary role of religion is to ensure fidelity to reality. That is fidelity to the past, fidelity to the future, and fidelity to Gaia, or the body of life. And the way that this has been done is naming good and evil. This is no other aspect of culture is going to do this. If religion fails in this, no other aspect of society is going to pick this up. Naming good and evil, because every culture or society had to pursue ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness, usually in that order. And so if religion, in fact, what's good is that which promotes ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness. What's evil is that which diminishes or destroys ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness. This is not moral rocket science. So an ecocentric view of good and evil, that is a life-centered view rather than a human-centered view. Aldo Leopold said it well. He said, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the diversity, stability, and the beauty of the life community. A thing is wrong when it tends otherwise. Albert Schweitzer said, ethics is nothing other than reverence for life. Reverence for life provides the fundamental principle of morality, namely, that good consists in maintaining, assisting, and enhancing life, and to destroy, to harm, or to hinder life is evil. One of my favorite quotes from Thomas Berry. He said, given humanity's huge and devastating impact on the larger body of life, our predicament and our way into the future can be summarized in 3 sentences. The glory of the human has become the desolation of the earth. The desolation of earth is now our greatest shame and biggest threat. Therefore, all programs, policies, activities, and institutions must henceforth be judged primarily by the extent to which they inhibit, ignore, or foster a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. My sort of down-to-earth way of saying that is from now on, everything needs to be judged by whether it's pro-future or anti-future. All of our programs, policies, activities, institutions, theologies, philosophies, do they help us be a blessing to the future, or do they cause us to be a curse to the future? This is the fundamental distinction, not left or right or liberal or conservative, but pro-future or anti-future. Good people are dangerous, and great people will engage in great evil when their God is not synonymous with reality, or when their map of reality is outdated by privileging ancient mythic texts over current evidential revelation. But good people are also dangerous and will engage in great evil when they hold the ecocidal and self-terminating belief that we are destiny's darlings, masters of the universe, conquerors of nature, God's chosen species, or the pinnacle of evolution. Cultures have a foundation, and if your foundation is human-centeredness, is anti-future, or if your foundation is ecocentric, or what I call eco-theocentric, pro-future, that's the difference. And again, anthropocentric cultures have a sense of humans first, limitless progress, short-term, profit-driven, and ecocidal. Ecocentric or eco-theocentric, life first, seventh generation, sacred limits, and consequence capture. And all the different aspects of society, the different aspects of culture are built upon those foundations. And it's one of the reasons that we have over 100 examples, like 120 examples of previous civilizations that have gone through the boom and bust cycle. And we don't have a single example of any city-based agricultural civilization that didn't self-destruct. That is, no unsustainable civilization has ever transformed and become sustainable on the way down because the foundation is fundamentally different. So I want to shift in this final segment to talking about the difference between anti-future religious interpretations and pro-future religious interpretations. That is, unnatural versus undeniable. Belief-based faith is make-believe. It's like, I'll make it if I just believe, right? Versus life-based faith, which is knowledge and experience-based. It's not about beliefs at all. Anti-future or unnatural religion is human-centered, otherworldly, anti-nature, and it's all about me. Whereas life-based faith is reality-centered, this-worldly, pro-nature, and it's all about life. It's not just all about us. And all the different religions, see, this is the interesting thing, whether you're talking about Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, the monotheistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, even neo-paganism. In fact, even atheism and humanism can be interpreted in either an anti-future way that's unfaithful to the past, the future, and the body of life, or in a pro-future way, in a way that's faithful. All of these traditions can be interpreted in both ways. So I want to just use as just one case example, the Christian tradition, because that's the tradition that I grow out of. Unnatural beliefs versus undeniable knowledge and experience. Supernatural is synonymous with unnatural. Anything that's supposedly supernatural is by definition unnatural. But unnatural is pretty uninspiring when you really stop and think deeply about it. For example, does this sound like the gospel, like the good news to you? An unnatural king who occasionally engages in unnatural acts, supernatural interventions, sends his unnatural son to the earth in an unnatural way. He's born through an unnatural birth, lives an unnatural life, performing all sorts of unnatural deeds, and is killed naturally. He then unnaturally raises from the dead in order to redeem us from an unnatural curse brought about by an unnaturally talking snake. After 40 days of unnatural appearances to some of his followers, he unnaturally zooms off to heaven to return to his unnatural father, to sit on an unnatural throne, and to unnaturally judge the living and the dead. And if you profess to believe in all this unnatural activity, you and your fellow believers get to go to an unnaturally boring place for an unnaturally long period of time, while everyone else suffers an unnatural, torturous hell forever. Now, please understand, I'm not mocking the gospel, but I am mocking an unnatural interpretation, an otherworldly only interpretation of what gets called the gospel. So I want to take a look at just some of the core elements of the Christian tradition and show how they can be interpreted in an anti-future or a pro-future way. That is human-centered, unnatural, versus life-centered, undeniable interpretations of some key Christian concepts and symbolic language. For example, the Trinity. I spoke about God. God, thought of as a supernatural entity who resides off the planet and outside the universe, is unnatural. God, understood as a personification of nature, as an I-thou relationship to what's inescapably real, is undeniable. Reality is real. The Trinity. How does reality show up to us? The three in one. Well, reality shows up temporally as past, future, and present, right? The past is the creator. That is a personification of the past, all the creativity of the past that brought this moment to existence. That's the first person of the Trinity. What does the past give birth to? What's the only, to speak in Christian mythic language, the only son of the Father, that is the only child of the past, which is the future. And so when we make the future our guiding principle, to speak in Christian mythic language, to make Jesus our Lord, to make Christ our Lord, that is how the future personified as our guide, and the only place that we can either honor or dishonor the past and to be a blessing or a curse to the future is in the present moment. So for me, I don't believe in the Trinity. I experience the Trinity with every breath. When I breathe in, I'm breathing in atoms that were created in the past. And there's that still point, and then I breathe out, and all those atoms become a part of the future. So for me, the Trinity is inescapably real, undeniably real. Faith is trust, trusting reality, accepting what's so, loving what is, cherishing what's real. These are all different ways of saying faith in God. The classic understanding of God as all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, right? Omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. If you think of God as a supernatural entity that has these human characteristics of all knowledge, all love, all, power, then you trivialize this. If you realize we're talking about a personification of power, a personification of love, a personification of knowledge, then all the knowledge of every creature personified, that's omniscience. All the power in the universe, actual energy power, all the love that every creature exhibits, every kind of creature, this is inescapably real. The fall. I do a whole program on evolutionary psychology and evolutionary brain science. In fact, in the second program in this series, I cover some of that. But this sense of original sin isn't about our great, 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 great grandmother eating an apple. It's about dishonoring the grace limits of primary reality. When we dishonor the grace limits, we take ourselves out of paradise and put ourselves on the path to hell. And we can't save ourselves, only by making the future our Lord, to use mythic language, that is making the future the guiding principle of our lives, do we have any hope of redemption. And redemption doesn't necessarily mean our species will continue, but it does mean that we can at least attempt to undo some of the damage. I'll say a lot more about that in other programs. I say some of that actually in the first program in this series. Prayer and meditation. From this vantage point, prayer is communicating with reality. It's basically speaking as one would speak to any person and relating personally to reality, listening, not necessarily in words, but what is life telling us? What's the climate telling us? What are other species telling us? What is the acidification of the ocean telling us? What is life telling us about our impact? That's genuine prayer. Back when I thought of God as a supernatural being, prayer was praying to a divine being outside the universe to miraculously intervene according to however I was praying. But for me now, prayer, remember the nested sense, is like a cell in the body in communion with the very body of which it's a part. It's far more intimate, but it's also inescapably real. It's inescapably helpful when we do that. Meditation, for me, I understand meditation as paying attention at the speed of life. However we pay attention at the speed of life, that can be seen as meditation. Heaven and hell. Sure, is it possible to interpret heaven and hell as otherworldly places that you go to when you die? Well, there's millions of people that that's the way they think of it. For me, heaven and hell are inescapably real. When I'm in the place of self-righteousness, judgment, hatred, bitterness, self-centeredness, I don't have to die to go to hell. I'm in hell now. But when I'm in the place of love, kindness, consideration, integrity, generosity, compassion, I don't have to die to go to heaven. I'm in heaven now. These are dimensions of reality that we get to participate with how we be in the world. Judgment Day. If you think future generations will not judge us today, you're living in a dream world. The Judgment Day is real, it's just not otherworldly. I suggest that the Christian myth can be seen as universally true in this sense. It clearly and compellingly, to my mind, reveals the one and only way home for the prodigal species, and any species that evolves the ability to disregard or circumvent life's material grace limits. I can go into these in greater depth in any kind of Q&A session any church group wants to go into with me. Miriam McGillis, one of the great popularizers of Thomas Berry, Sister Miriam McGillis at Genesis Farm. She was so significant in my life that I named my youngest daughter Miriam after Sister Miriam. And she famously said that Jesus was like a finger pointing the way, pointing to the moon. But instead of following the way, we've been sucking on the finger, we meaning Christians. Evidence is how reality speaks. Evidence is modern day scripture. It's our main source of divine guidance, authoritative guidance today. Anytime any religious tradition says God said this or God did that, what follows is always an interpretive personification. It's our inability to read mythic literature that's made us blind and deaf to what God or reality has been revealing for centuries. So I want to conclude with, and I've checked this out, I've spent actually a couple of years working with other scholars and theologians and environmentalists and scientists on what is reality telling us? What can we say confidently that reality is clearly telling us through evidence? Like, thus saith the Lord, 10 commandments to avoid extinction, or at least attempt to avoid extinction and redeem our species. So this is thus saith reality, grace limits for the 21st century. And again, these aren't locked in stone. Feel free to improve on these. But I think you'll see that this is what reality is telling us. The first several of them having to do with idolatry. Stop thinking of me as anything less than the voice of undeniable, inescapable reality. Stop thinking of revelation, divine instruction, or God's word apart from evidence. Stop thinking of your sacred creation story apart from the history of the universe. Stop thinking of theology apart from ecology, the interdisciplinary study of my nature. Oh, by the way, the reason that they all start with stop is in the traditional 10 commandments. Notice they're virtually all thou shalt nots, because it turns out that limits are our problem, that we need limits, right? So stop defining and measuring progress in short-term human-centered ways. So these all have to do with idolatry. These are the practical ones. Stop extinguishing species and allowing the free or subsidized polluting of the commons. Stop using renewable resources faster than they can be replenished. Stop using non-renewable resources in ways that harm and rob future generations. Stop creating chemicals and substances that cannot be eaten by other life forms. And stop prioritizing the wants of the wealthy over the needs of the poor. I have a 20-minute video up on YouTube called Reality's Rules, 10 Commandments to Avoid Extinction, where I actually have like a paragraph or two on each of those. Carl Sagan, one of my favorite quotes from Carl Sagan, he said, "How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, subtler, more elegant. God must be even greater than we dreamed." A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, he suggested, such a religion will emerge. Well, I think he was correct in the intuition and wrong in the detail. I think such a worldwide meta-religious movement has been emerging for decades, largely unnoticed, at the nexus of the intersection of science, inspiration, and sustainability. Beliefs are secondary. What unites us is a pool of common values, priorities, and commitments regarding living in right relationship to reality, and together being a stand for a just and sustainably life-giving future. So I call this evolving faith, evidential mysticism, as I mentioned before, sacred realism or religious naturalism. I think these principles unite tens of millions of us around the world, secular and religious alike. Reality is our God. Evidence is our scripture. The epic of evolution is our creation story. Ecology is our theology. Integrity is our spiritual path. And by integrity, what I'm meaning is those practices and exercises that help us live in right relationship to reality. So reality is our God, evidence is our scripture. The epic of evolution is our creation story. Ecology is our theology. Integrity is our spiritual path. And fidelity to reality, fidelity to time and nature is our mission. 4 questions that reveal our collective insanity. Is God real, or does God exist? To even ask that question is to betray the fact that you're already living in a culture that doesn't treat reality as divine, that doesn't treat the ecosphere as a greater thou, not a lesser it. Will civilization collapse? Well, every unsustainable civilization collapses, yes. It's not will it collapse. We're actually 25 to 30 years into collapse already. Will we go extinct? Well, of course we'll go extinct. Every species goes extinct. It may be in the near term. It may be that we'll be graced with another 1,000,000 or 2,000,000 years before an asteroid or supervolcano or something takes us out. But no mammal our size lasts more than 3 or 4 million years typically. And then is it too late? Is there any hope? Well, yeah, it's too late to save industrialism from the consequences of its own actions. But no, it's not too late for everything that gives life value, everything that's important in life. It's absolutely not too late. And in the second program in this series, Post-Gloom, Deeply Adapting to Reality, I go into that. Again, this is just the third of 3 standalone programs in this collapse and adaptation primer. Just to give you a sense, if you've already watched these, you can turn this off now. But if you haven't watched the first 2, this is just a quickie introduction. Collapse 101, The Inevitable Fruit of Progress. I take a look at the big picture, understanding our predicament and our trajectory. What's inevitable and what's futile, as accepting reality and avoiding frustration. Progressing toward ecocide? Like, how is it that we've defined progress in ways that are leading to ecocide? So this is history's verdict regarding human-centeredness. And then problems versus predicaments. 5 stages of awakening and what I'm calling post-doom living. Big picture going into where are we and what does the evidence tell us about our near-term future and destiny. What's inevitable, what's futile, that is what opens up when we accept what we cannot change and avoid pushing boulders uphill. Progressing toward ecocide, why anthropocentric or human-centered measures of success and well-being compel habitat destruction and collapse. And problems versus predicaments. I take a look at Paul Trafurka's 5 stages of awakening, why an ecological and historical post-doom perspective is vital in collapsing times. The second in this series, Post-Gloom, Deeply Adapting to Reality. I take a look at our human condition, that culture rules, and that we have cognitive biases and social instincts. Inescapable temptation. We have mismatched instincts and we're living in a world of supernormal stimuli. So this is some of the stuff coming out of evolutionary psychology and brain science. Evidential inspiration, cherishing your star-stuffed nature and cherishing mortality. And then what can we do? Living meaningfully and courageously at Teotihuacan, that is the end of the world as we know it. The human condition, why living in right relationship to reality is hard to do in unfaithful anthropocentric cultures. Temptation, how the nature of our brain and our societies makes temptation and struggle almost inevitable. Why it's vital to have an ecological sense of self and to honor impermanence and death. And how might we be of joyous service to others, to life and to the future, no matter what. So if you want to explore this kind of collapse literate, historical and ecological way of thinking more deeply, go to postdoom.com/resources, and you'll find all the books that I've recorded and videos and other things there. Postdoom.com, all the post-doom conversations I've had. Here's our other 2 websites, michaeldowd.org and thegreatstory.org. And then this is my contact information.